Welcome to Making It with Terry Woolman, the show that explores the secrets, successes, and strategies for making it in the music biz. And now, here's your host, Terry Woolman.
Welcome to episode number 133 of Making It with me, your host, Terry Woolman. I really appreciate you joining us every week, and especially this week. This is the first episode that we're doing during the pandemic world health crisis. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank Blue Microphones and Mark of the Unicorn for their technical support in continuing to bring our show to you during this world health pandemic. Please continue to stay mindful and safe as we all work together as a global community. You can find all of our episodes on entertalkmedia.com, Apple Podcast, Spotify, or just go to terrywoolman.com. I hope you find my recent conversations with guests Gino Vanelli and Tony Basil and many other wonderful artists both comforting and inspiring and entertaining. I created this show to focus on what it takes to maintain a lasting career in the ever-changing landscape of the music and entertainment business. My guest today is master musician Peter Erskine. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Peter Erskine has played the drums since the age of 4 and is known for his versatility and love of working in different musical contexts. He appears on over 700 albums and film scores, has written 12 books, has won 2 Grammy Awards, and holds an honorary doctorate from the Berklee School of Music. Over 50 albums have been released under his own name or as co-leader. He's played with Stan Kenton, Maynard Ferguson, Weather Report, Steps Ahead, Joni Mitchell, Steely Dan, and Diana Krall, among others. Erskine has also appeared as a soloist with the London, Los Angeles, Chicago, Oslo, Helsinki, BBC, and Berlin Philharmonic Orchestras. Peter graduated from the Interlochen Arts Academy in Michigan and studied at Indiana University under George Gaber. He is currently the Director of Drumset Studies at the University of Southern California and continues to maintain a very active playing and recording career. Peter Erskine, welcome to Making It.
Thank you, Terry. It's good to be here in the literal and virtual sense.
It is, and it's nice to see you, even remotely.
Thank you. The wonders of technology.
Well, I like when they work to our advantage instead of our challenge.
Well, a good kind of critical mass has been reached at this moment. I feel that this whole digital democratization, at a certain point, it was it felt like it went beyond allowing everyone to participate, and the generation that initially got into this whole thing, us older, MIDI coming of age crowd, it was getting hard to keep up. I was starting to feel like left out of things because the software and means of making music, it was just progressing so quickly, which it still continues to do, but somehow it seems like things have gotten a bit simpler again, and more intuitive and kind of less foreign somehow. So, for example, I used to, for composing, I relied on using computers, and I became fairly adept at utilizing what the computers could do. And then all of a sudden, I just felt like, wow, I'm not understanding so much of what these can do. And then it seemed like the younger generation and the generation after them were just exploiting and using this stuff, to the nth degree of power and creativity. And I found myself going back to a pencil and a piece of paper for writing.
I love a piece of score paper and a pencil and a ruler.
It's great. And
But we're of the same generation, you and I. Yeah.
Well, you have a lot more hair than I do, but
well, I'm hanging on to it.
Attaboy. My good buddy Vince Mendoza years ago was giving me some advice about writing. He's one of my favorite writers of all time, and he said, "Well, the most important part of the pencil, right?" And I said, "What?" He said, "Well, it's the eraser." And I follow that line of thinking, and yet I'm sort of getting back into, not getting back into technology so much. It's just sort of feeling like, okay, I can use this stuff creatively, and indeed we have to now, because there's nobody to stand over our shoulder and point out, do it this way, or I'll do that for you. I mean, you can ask people advice, but kind of on our own now. We can go to YouTube. We can watch tutorials, and so in order for us to do our communication and our teaching, we're relying on the communication and teaching of others. Does that make sense, all of that?
It absolutely does. And it's interesting to me to hear you speak of that, because the reason it makes sense to me is we had to learn this on our own. When MIDI first came out, we were already working musicians. Yeah, but we went out and bought the first Apple computer and started learning it. And even our friends, like our dear friend Indugu Chancellor, he was one of the drummers who didn't fight it. He embraced it. He got one of the first Linn drum machines and learned how to program it. So you and I have been learning as we go, where the next generation, the generation that you teach, because you are very involved in education, they've had the luxury, in a way, to learn it formally in school instead of being self-taught as we've been. So it's kind of a little bit humorous to me that your struggle is the same as mine with staying on top of the technology. So I get it.
I think it's called getting old.
Yeah.
But, I remember, it's like someone describing how they walked through the snow uphill both directions to go to school.
Of course.
But back in the day,
you actually did growing up in New Jersey. I grew up in Miami, so it was all fiction to me.
New Jersey and in northern Michigan, there was a lot of snow. But in the post-weather report days, when the band Steps, which later became known as Steps Ahead, when we were doing some writing and kind of pre-production on the album Modern Times, which is still one of my favorite recordings that I've worked on. This was pre-MIDI. This is when each synthesizer company had its own proprietary system, for its own devices to communicate with one another. And there was no, I remember we were using the Oberheim DSX sequencing device, and you would input notes. If you made a mistake, there was no undo.
Right. I remember that.
And it was a very laborious manual input method. And if you weren't paying attention, like with each bit of data entry, your finger hit two notes on the keyboard by mistake, which a keyboard player wouldn't do, but a drummer easily could, and I did. You had to start all over again. It was wild, but
it was kind of like a chisel and an anvil, against a piece of stone. It was very basic.
A reductive form of productive creation, I guess.
Yeah, well said. I want to take this hour as a masterclass, talk about your new book, which I have right here in front of me. Musician's Lifeline, which people are not going to be able to see, but I'm holding it in my hand right now. I'm noticing as I've been reading this book the past few weeks, it's lessons about music, but there are a lot of lessons about life and things that feel very applicable to what's going on right now in our isolation, which I encourage everybody again to take this seriously and remain isolated. But how are you and your family holding up?
Well, thank you for asking. My wife and I we're both healthy.
Good.
Thank goodness. And we've been as careful as we can be, not only following the suggestions or the requirements of the stay-at-home directives and social distancing and all that stuff. Very conscious about washing our hands often with plenty of soap and hot water. But otherwise, grateful for this chance to be at home and to wake up in the morning and not have to run off to some appointment or session or something. The negative side, but this is the same negative that everyone experienced. Myself along with countless other musicians or freelance gigging folks. We lost all our work.
Yeah.
So, I'm the kind of guy that, if someone spilled something on the table, I get a little manic, kind of, or panicked.
Mm-hmm.
But when the bad stuff really hits the fan, I think like a lot of other folks, I get very calm. I've noticed this when we've had earthquakes, and even when all this was starting to happen, I was like, okay, so you kind of pull back and you can see kind of a big picture. And everyone I've run into just seems to be realizing if they're not thrust in the middle of being on the front lines of fighting this virus and this disease and contagion, etc. We're all smelling the roses, as it were, and we're realizing life is precious, and we really need to tell the folks we love that we do love them. I miss being in the physical presence of our two children. We're teleconferencing. We're staying in very close touch. And otherwise, my wife and I are just really having a very nice time being together.
Yeah, it's a very bonding experience for my wife and I as well. Just cooking for each other, and
I started cooking, and it's fun.
Yeah,
it's reading.
Yes.
Learning some new software. Maybe that's why I felt kind of like I'm getting back, because I finally have some time to actually sit down and figure some of this stuff out. So, the great drummer Antonio Sanchez posted a thought. We're all posting thoughts on Facebook and the like. That this was perhaps Mother Nature's way of kind of slowing down, things, that creating some sort of ecological response to the perpetual climate warming that showed no signs of slowing down. For the first time in ages, that has all slowed down. The freshness of the air. I mean, seeing. You'll pardon me, I can't remember if it was dolphins or porpoises
it's dolphins and swans returning to the canals,
to the Venice canals. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yes.
So, I hope that everyone listening is in good health. Reading about the effects of this COVID-19 disease, it's a horrible thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm just praying, kind of the oxymoronic thought of praying that science will get us out of this as soon as possible.
Yeah.
But if we're in this thing, the best thing we can do if we are healthy is to stay healthy, and like they say, flatten that curve, and use the time to not only I think recharge ourselves to be better functioning and better people, but do whatever we can to make the world just a little bit better for everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Well said. And even with all the comments and moments of inspiration that people are sharing, like one thing that's bringing me comfort is even our friend Jerry Hay is posting photos on his isolated walks. And I kind of feel like I'm experiencing the joy that he's experiencing from just quieting down and walking the neighborhood and looking at the ocean.
I've seen those photos. They are inspiring. They're beautiful.
Yeah, they are. You mentioned this sense of calmness that you have when something spills, or
when something spills, I freak. When the whole earth is falling apart, I get very calm.
Well, in a way that sounds like it's a more practical approach to going through life.
That's the way I think every dad is.
Well, were you that way when you were a little kid? I know part of that is just your practice. I know when I see you walk out onto a stage to perform, there's a calmness that you bring into each of your performances. You don't walk in frantic. You walk in centered and grateful and ready.
Oh, well,
and
thanks.
Open.
I've been doing it a long time.
Well, since you were 4.
But yeah, exactly. But also it's part of the job description, I think.
Yeah.
It's just like if I flew an airplane, when you or a jet, when you see the pilot or the co-pilot walk into the cockpit, it's a reassuring thing because these are professional pilots and they're well trained and they know what they're doing. So it's just having ownership of that skill set.
Right.
But in life, I mean, it was interesting going shopping a couple times. And we didn't witness any, fights, people fighting over, a package of toilet paper.
Right, there's a compassion that's rising.
Well, there was, but there was also a weird with some people in the shop. They were like, can I use colorful language on?
Yes, you
the
can.
show? Okay. I mean, there definitely was a vibe of, you get the fuck out of my way, kind of vibe from some people. And
yeah, I felt that too.
And I was like, okay, go ahead.
After you.
Yeah, because I was just like, I was really trying to, but that said, I realized that there was this much older gentleman standing behind my wife and myself, and he had like 3-4 things, and I was kicking myself later. I said, I really just should have let this guy check out in front of us, but he was fine. He was, we were having a nice conversation. So, as we were waiting outside this grocery store, in the pre-dawn hours, waiting for them to open, and there was already a big line. Everything's calmed down now. But I was trying to engage in conversation, and some people were very open and very relaxed, and other people were really in uptight mode. And you can't blame anybody for being uptight. I mean, this is all pretty freaky stuff that's going on right now.
Well, I think any kind of catastrophe or challenge in life brings out the best and the worst of us, and sometimes both simultaneously, because we're all imperfect beings, and
that's true.
Some of us try harder than others, and I appreciate those that do.
Well, I'm gonna. I hope it's not too clumsy of a segue.
Not at all.
But I want to salute the folks at the University of Southern California, our president, the provost, our dean at the Thornton School of Music, Dean Cudietta, our vice dean in charge of the Contemporary Music Studies, Dan Carlin. They've all been proactive, and they've had a lot of foresight. I think most of us a few weeks ago felt that, wow, are they overreacting? This seems kind of soon to be canceling classes, and they were seeing far enough ahead. So all of us faculty members were able to get a good jump start on how best to continue teaching and functioning as a university community. And I mentioned just because this is so much on my mind, because this past week was supposedly our spring break, but I was probably spending more time every day preparing online teaching kind of systems, collaborating with other professors. Everyone's it has been kind of an all hands on deck situation, and a lot of my fellow teachers are musicians. These are musicians that I play with, I make music with, but we're all in that bucket line of trying to do what we can in this situation. Isn't that what you call the bucket line? When,
yeah.
Like when you're trying to put out a fire.
Mm-hmm.
Which reminds me of a hilarious story. Years ago, when I was playing in Weather Report, we joined a bunch of other artists on the CBS label, and we went down to Havana, Cuba, and it was called the Havana Jam, and their wordplay was kind of like having a jam. Which,
clever.
It sounds like dad humor.
You still have the T-shirt?
I think I gave it to some girl.
Right.
A long time ago. But okay, so we're down there with a bunch of jazz musicians and a bunch of rock and pop musicians, and it was a pretty momentous gathering of players. We were all under the impression that we would be playing for La Gente, all the people. Mm-hmm. It was an invited audience of primarily, Communist Party officials who weren't so musically inclined. Mm-hmm. But word was getting out, and the musical community in Cuba, they were desperate to come to these concerts. Ultimately, I think the audience was savvy enough and appreciative of what was happening, and we all had a I want to say a great time. Jaco Pastorius was my roommate on this trip. We had to double up in the hotel.
Wow, that's a couple of episodes right there.
That sure was, and he wasn't doing well that trip. Mm-hmm. He was really missing Ingrid. I think his marriage to Tracy was, I don't know, between guilt and longing, he was a mess.
Yeah.
Anyway, we get through this whole thing, and we're all pretty anxious to come back home. And we all go to the airport early in the day. So here's Stephen Stills, Billy Joel, Chris Christopherson, Jaco Pastorius, Hubert Laws, John McLaughlin, Tony Williams, Stan Getz, Bobby Hutcherson. I mean, it was just wild, amazing group of musicians.
Yeah.
And our flight's delayed. Why is our flight delayed? Well, the conveyor belt system has broken down in the airport, and the workers can't load the plane. So when we find out, is that it? What's it going to take to get the bags out to the plane? Say, well, somebody has it. So we somehow wrangle permission from the authorities at this airport in Havana
to self-load the plane.
In Havana, we formed this bucket brigade.
Wow!
And here's John McLaughlin and Jocko and Tony Williams and Stephen Stills and all of Billy Joel's band and all of us in Weather Report, and we're
passing suitcases and bags.
We're handing Russian suitcases to each other to load up this Russian. I don't know if it's a charter flight or a commercial flight, all these Russian tourists, because if there weren't Cubans on the island, everybody looked like Brezhnev. I mean, it was just a bunch of Russian people. So here's some of the greatest musicians in the world. We're loading
the bucket line.
We got the bucket. Yeah, we got the bucket line of people. So, and then we did the same with our own bags, but that felt like a little better doing that.
Well, it certainly shows the resourcefulness of musicians. The what does it take to get this done attitude.
Yeah. And I mean, it's I can't say it's a real American trait, but it's always been what I've always regarded as that American can-do-ism kind of thing, which we seem to be seeing where it can happen. I mean, just trying to get protective, I guess PPE, protective personal equipment, to our the front line of health responders.
Right. And you had this beautiful idea the other day I saw through Facebook and email that we both have been following up on with some of the companies that we work with, and disc makers. Tony Van Veen, the CEO, who I've had on this show, he has managed, he had to shut down his factories, but somehow he managed to work with the medical community and the government to repurpose some of his machines so they can be making face guards and masks for doctors. And I have been reaching. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. It's fantastic.
It's wonderful.
Do it. And so I somewhat presumptuously, it's one of those easy for me to suggest things, but, drum heads are made of clear mylar plastic. Couldn't these be fashioned into protective face masks?
I don't think it's presumptuous. I think it's clear. It's simple. It's a simple idea, but it was worth mentioning.
And when I look at photos of these things, it's a clear plastic, a piece of plastic with foam, and kind of a headband. Mm-hmm. It's a relatively simple device. I know for a fact that Remo they've got that foam sitting around. They've got the mylar sitting around. Unfortunately, they don't have any workers sitting around because the factory was closed. And the same with the Diodario company. And they also make and market Evans drum heads, and they're located all the way on the East Coast on Long Island. Mm-hmm. Way on the far end of Long Island, mm-hmm. and Remo's way, on the left side of the country in California. So I thought this would be really remarkable if the two companies could somehow coordinate. And I mean, we're in a wartime situation here, and the country's done it before. I'd rather talk about art and not politics, but it's a stunning.
Misstep, missed opportunity.
Yeah, stunning missed opportunity and mismanagement, and I'm not sure what explains the level of inaction and all the lost time. But anyway, back to. Back to music.
Before you do that, let me just say thank you for the idea and And I know a few of your friends followed up on it, and I did as well. I told you privately I had reached out directly to John Daddario, the CEO, and he really appreciated the idea. And their team is already working on trying to figure out how to do that.
Well, I hope they can. When I didn't hear from any of them, I thought, oh, they probably got annoyed.
No, I can tell you. I'll share the email with you privately later. But
okay.
It was kind and appreciative.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So
well, we all need to do what we can.
Yeah.
And at this point, I don't see myself doing any kind of manufacturing, but at least if I can make some music and if I can spread some information and that's it. And if nothing else, prepare myself for ways to contribute down the road. I mean, right now, I think the best all of us can do is just stay the hell home.
Right. Let's talk about you and art and music and education and your book as well. I wanted to ask you, you grew up in Somers Point, New Jersey.
No, I was born in Somers Point, but I grew up in the adjacent town called Linwood.
Oh, Linwood, okay.
Linwood, New Jersey.
So just starting playing drums at age of 4, I'm curious, what was your early family like, and who encouraged you to embrace your love of music at such a young age?
Well, my dad had been a bass player before he became a medical doctor and ultimately a psychiatrist. He exposed or introduced music to all 4 children. I was the youngest. But it seemed like, I took to it the quickest or most readily. My 2 sisters and brother, I think, had other interests and talents. So anyway, music was kind of my thing. And as a result, I think I was the fortunate recipient of probably more of his attention than my siblings got, just because he was a music fan. He identified so much with music, and he really enjoyed it. That said, my mom was also very supportive, and she was supportive of everyone. But the beauty of it was that my 2 sisters and my late brother were all very supportive as well, because, let's face it, practicing the drums before going to school, that takes some measure of forbearance.
Yeah, it's a family event.
Yeah, exactly. So they were all great, and my sisters had a tendency on occasion to date jazz musicians. Some of them kind of well known, and so I benefited from this exposure just to being around these musicians, and oftentimes they'd want me to get the hell out of, leave them alone. So they'd, here, listen to this Miles Davis record. And so at a very early age, I was.
You thought they were mentoring you, but they were just trying to get rid of you. Exactly. Get a little alone time with your sister.
Yeah.
Everybody still benefited.
Well, it was just great, getting exposed to music, and I got to tell you, the most fun thing is that we were talking about the digital life and everything. I finally got a turntable again, and even though I pretty much decimated my LP collection and sold off most of it to a record store in Japan. Which was an interesting process.
Yeah, I would imagine.
They go, $1 for this, $1 for this. Oh, we'll give you $80 for this. I was like, huh? And they were like, yeah, this one's really, a popular album. So, even though I lost quite a few records, I kept a precious few, and I was trying to figure out what am I going to do with these. So I got a turntable for my media room in the house, and even though I had an old Denon table here in my recording studio, it's really great to be able to listen to music, in my library, in the house, and
Like we used to. We used to listen in our bedroom or our friend's bedroom.
yeah, and it's just a different listening experience, putting on the one side and just really focusing on that 14, 16, 18, 20 minutes of music. So it's sort of like discovering music again. It really is fun, and I was kind of tapping back into that sense of discovery I had as a kid. Listening to stuff, and of course when I was a kid, being born in 1954, and I'm learning how to handle a record player on my own by 1959, 1960. And the next 10 years that followed, I mean, this was an incredible time for recorded music.
It was.
So
that was our rabbit hole that we would go down. That was
so much fun, so good. Anyway, I'm the lucky recipient of being exposed to a lot of music, being supported by a loving family, and growing up in a time when you heard a piece of music, it really meant something. I'm not saying that it doesn't now, but there was just a different relationship because you got one LP maybe each week or each couple of weeks, or and you listened to it over and over again, and you knew every note, and you read the
every liner credit.
The liner credits, and you knew everything about everybody who played on that record, everything that they were willing to tell you. And if you have 10,000 songs in your, we used to say iPod, but now it's in your smartphone or whatever device, it's different. That said, Terry, it's great. I mean, yesterday, a friend of mine, suggested the final movement of the Beethoven Piano Concerto No. 1, and they said it's so cheerful. So I put it on, and damn, man, it really is cheerful, and it put me in a great mood, and the fact that I could access it like that, and I didn't have to
wait 2 weeks for your allowance, or mowing another lawn or cleaning another pool, whatever we did.
Right. So anyway, that I grew up in that just really wonderful time in recorded music. I got to hear a lot of great stuff live because my dad took me to a lot of gigs. And my education, I had a wonderful teacher from Atlantic City, New Jersey, a drummer named Johnny Severa. And then I went to these summer jazz camps that were hosted by Stan Kenton and his big band. And at the very first camp I went to in 1961, not only was the Kenton band there, but Cannonball Adderley's sextet was there. So not only was I able to get some drum lessons from Louis Hayes, but I met Joe Zawinul. So
back then, wow!
Yeah, when I was 7 years old, I met two of my future bosses, Stan Kenton, and Joe Zawinul. And years later, when I joined Weather Report, Zawinul said, "Yeah, I remember you. You were that funny-looking kid with the little short pants who played the drums." Everybody did was a funny-looking little kid.
Of course, that's nothing unique about that, except perhaps your talent and your curiosity and drive.
Well,
is this part of the reason?
Curiosity. I'll graciously thank you and accept that compliment. That was, I think, that's, and I remember once my dad and I were at a bus stop, and I was in the middle of asking him some questions, and some other guy who was standing, an adult, turned and said, "Boy, that kid sure asks a lot of questions." And my dad's response, I don't remember the exact words, but I just remember like he had my back, and and his answer, he was also encouraging me that this was a great thing to always have questions.
Do you think that's part of the reason that you have been drawn towards being an educator and somehow managing that from an outside perspective quite well to maintain a career as a performer, as an artist, as a sideman, composer, producer, and also still be teaching? Why is that important to you?
I think there's two reasons. One, the whole thing of paying it forward, and this was the example set by the first jazz musicians I met. I was 7 years old, and they're all teaching. So that seemed natural. And when I joined the Kenton Band in 1972, we spent more than half our time on the road teaching. So you kind of had to get it together. But the greater inspiration, I think, was my dad. He was a wonderful teacher, and he liked teaching. He would teach unsolicited teaching of my friends, the correcting them when their grammar was incorrect, or my good friend Johnny Martin, who's passed away. But we were real close buddies in grade school, and John had some pronunciation issues. And every morning when John would stop by the house to pick me up on our way to school, my dad would set aside a couple of minutes and do a little like vocal exercise with Johnny just to try to help him.
How nice!
All right, Johnny. Okay, that's good. Now let's try saying this or something. So, yeah, he was just naturally a very gifted and a loving kind of a teacher. If at times, not intolerant. What do you call it when he just had high expectations, and so you didn't want to disappoint those.
I think he recognized in people what they were capable of and didn't want to stand idly by without pointing them towards where he thought they could be.
Well, nicely put.
Both of my parents were educators, not in music, so I can relate to some of the things that you're saying, and I think that sometimes even in hosting this show, I mean, it's about sharing information. It's about lifting people. It's about giving a platform for people to share their point of view about art and life. But I sometimes think that it sounds like with you as well, that teaching is in our DNA from the families that we grew up in. Or just the love and respect and reverence for sharing information and education.
Well, I hope it's that, and I hope it's not just wanting to tell people how to do things. Which is,
are you a control freak?
Well, yeah. I mean, that when you say the DNA or the RNA or whatever, that's a thing that drummers share. I mean, that's part of the reason we become drummers. And
right, you drive the bus.
We drive the bus, and we were talking about that sense of ownership. Just so the band leader or the conductor or the arranger or the artist, the vocalist, whoever, that's one less thing that they maybe need to think or worry about. Okay, boom. The tempo is going to be, the time, the feel, whatever, it's going to be good. So as I was, trying to get closer, I guess, to the drumming ideals that had always kind of been floating around, but as you're growing up and you're wrestling with the instrument or you're learning stuff, you do the best you can, and the path for me at a certain point seemed to be like we were talking about chiseling, in this reductive kind of art. Drumming, I had to really take a reductive approach because I was very unsatisfied by what I was hearing. from my playing. I was boring myself by what I was hearing. So I found that by, that kind of taking that Vince Mendoza advice about the eraser being the most important part of the pencil and applying that to my drumming, I was getting much closer all of a sudden to the ideal that maybe had been planted so many years before by way of listening and maybe by way of who knows what.
Yeah, being mentored.
And the instinctive response by a lot of people is to credit you with being, if not musically gracious, being musically generous. That's a very generous way to play, to not overplay. Right? I mean, it makes sense.
Right. Absolutely.
But in fact, I said, well, thanks, but it's as egocentric as it ever was. It's just a much more clever and reliable way of being the puppeteer. And I enjoy that. I love surrendering to the music and everything that's happening, but I really like shaping it if I feel it needs shaping. And the best way for a drummer to shape the music is not by trying to bludgeon or hammer it into a direction, but by kind of, it's almost like some kind of martial arts sort of thing, I imagine.
It very much is, and do you practice martial arts?
No, I was just going to say, I can talk a good martial arts game, but no, I don't.
Well, I've studied karate for the past 20 years, and I took it up based on a spinal injury and having to have a fusion in my neck from a bicycle accident and wrong place, wrong time, and the thing is, and I'm okay now, and very grateful. But martial arts kind of got me through the recovery. And I found it was, at the beginning, it was completely foreign from music to me, but then it became very connected and very much the same. And they became very integrated. So I agree with you as somebody who has studied and practiced that it's very much the same thing. There's a technique, probably has different names in different dojos and forms, but it's called soft eye. And you just kind of relax and you slow yourself down and you try to see everything in a relaxed way. And it's kind of like how we listen, we open ourselves up to trying to be present and to listen. In martial arts, it's to see everything, just sort of to look not at somebody's eyes or their feet, but just sort of the center. Soft eyes is what they call it. And the other thing is they teach you, if somebody's coming at you with a punch, to not blink and not flinch, just relax. Because if you stay relaxed, time slows down a little bit and you can see things coming.
Right.
Which is very much like the way my experience as a musician and listening is you become intuitive as to where things can go or are going.
Exactly. And then there's no mystery and it's not even like a coincidence that you and the other musician kind of arrive at the same moment. Not that right. You're copying or imitating one another or doing things in unison, but that you're just doing things in such a perfect kind of, that right kind of harmony. It reminds me, Terry, of what Jaco was trying to hit me to years ago. When I first joined Weather Report, I was pretty fearless. But then, Zawinul came from that school of jazz musicians. If they thought they smelled any blood, they would try to exploit that weakness and find it. So I went from being fearless to being somewhat fearful and kind of looking for approval of what I was playing. and trying to figure out what it was that Joe wanted. And Jaco got very frustrated because the nature of my kind of musical essence or energy had changed. So he finally came up to me exasperated. He said, "Hey, man," he said, "stop thinking so much." He said, "Just concentrate."
Right.
Which, in other words, just listen.
Yes.
You know. Hey, I got to tell you the greatest story, and you will understand and appreciate this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm on tour with Joni Mitchell, and this is the tour with the orchestras, and Vince Mendoza's conducting, and the wonderful Chuck Berghofer's playing bass, and Bob Shepard was the soloist, and
saxophone.
In a few cities, Herbie Hancock was the guest piano player. He didn't tour with us, but just in a couple different cities, including New York, Herbie was invited to play, and so we're set up. Joni and Vince are downstage closest to the audience, and there's a piano, and then Chuck on bass and myself on drums were behind the piano. And then the orchestra kind of wraps around us. A pretty good-sized orchestra. So anyway, we're in Madison Square Garden in New York. Not the big, huge arena, but they used to call it the Felt Forum. It's the smaller of the two venues there. Anyway, nice venue. Really excellent orchestra that they put together in New York. And the concert's going great. And they go, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, Herbie Hancock." So Vince counts off, and Chuck and I start playing the vamp. Whatever. And Herbie comes out, and he smiles, waves to the audience, and he sits down without any fanfare, but he just sits down, and immediately, so it's going 1, 2, 3, 4, boo, bop. He just plays two chords. And my right hand is playing on the ride cymbal. Honest to God, I felt it go, and it moved, and it locked. It's like Herbie threw this kung fu thing at me. Not at me. I mean, He threw it out to the universe, kind of thing.
Yeah, and you received it.
Yeah. And I still get goosebumps when I think about it. It's the only time I've ever experienced that. That his rhythmic power was so focused and so strong and so relaxed and yet so laser beamed that it blew my mind. And I just, for the rest of the tune, I'm kind of just looking at my right hand in amazement and looking at him, and I thought, this is the, I've worked with a lot of great musicians, and I'm really grateful for every musician I've gotten to work with. But man, Herbie,
that moment,
it's unlike anything else I've ever experienced. And so
it's fantastic.
And I don't know if I even had a chance to. And I'm sure if I told Herbie, he would just look at me and laugh. But man, it was heavy, and it sure was fun. What a cool thing.
Can I give a couple of tips from you that I was reading in your book, Musician's Lifeline? Can I share a few things?
Now, can I do the setup?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, Dave Black, an author and editor at Alfred Music and a drummer, he and I collaborated on this book called The Drummer's Lifeline. And it was basically a collection of hacks and just a potpourri of drumming advice that just couldn't figure out where or how else to put it in some other book. So the book does okay, and we thought, why don't we do a Musician's Lifeline follow-up? And Dave said, okay, well, maybe it'd be a good idea to invite a few people we know, and he mentioned a couple musicians, and then I thought, well, wait a minute, why restrict it to that, kind of select group, and how no matter who chose what group, the demographics weren't going to be satisfying. So I said, what if, instead of asking for, this person to give that advice or the other person, I said, what if we contact like every musician I know and every musician you know and ask them the same set of questions? So essentially 7 questions, including, what's the best advice you've ever received? What's the best advice you've ever given? Is there one thing you would have done differently in your education or your career? Travel advice, and, business advice, getting along with people. We also delved into auditions and performance anxiety and the like. So out of 250.
Also, another great question: any advice related to people skills? Right,
people skills. I think I should have had some advice for improving your memory, but
I'll pre-order that one.
250 people that we sent these questions to. We got 165 responses, which is pretty good.
Yeah,
rate of return, and all of them thoughtful. A few of them snarky. But yeah, just, and these were musicians in symphony orchestras throughout the U.S. and in Europe and Japan, jazz musicians, classical musicians, folk musicians, vocalists, composers, people in the kind of ancillary parts of the music business, who work in promotion, or photographers and the like. So, anyway, that's the setup for the book, and then the team at Alfred Publishing, including the graphic designer, really came up with a terrific way of presenting all this stuff, so it wasn't boring.
The graphics are fantastic.
Yeah.
It's like a composition visually, and it matches the content. I think it's so fantastic the way the words
She
flow.
did a marvelous job. Do me a favor. Can you
Yep.
find her name? And I don't have the copy of the book with me.
Here it is. Her name is Holly Frazier.
All right, we can do a shout out. Anyway, so you were gonna ask a question or read a quote?
I wanted to read a couple of quotes and just ask you to elaborate on them. And one of them came to mind when you were already talking about listening. These are tips. And you say, listen to the music and play what you'd like to hear, as well as saying, compose when you play.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the advice I give to every student, and I say we could, whether it's a year of study, a week of study, or 4 years of study, I say we could pretty much reduce it all to the following sentence. Just play what you'd like to hear. And so this means that, number one, each musician develops his or her own sense of vocabulary, and that they can imagine music, right? That they can imagine a musical response, musical contribution to whatever moment they're in. If you play what you'd like to hear, then what you play will be true. I can't know what you'd like to hear. And so if I try to second guess, what would Terry like to hear me play? Now, if Terry requests, Peter, we'd like this kind of a feel on the tune. Okay, But as I'm playing, if I'm looking at you, kind of like I used to look at Joe Zawinul, does he like what I'm doing? How can I tell? And maybe I'm drumming and Steve Gadd and Jack DeJohnette and Sting and who knows who else are on the other side of the wall listening.
Right.
Or maybe they're not. And maybe they love it or maybe they don't. And what does that have to do with what I'm playing? It doesn't change the sound of what I'm doing. So don't bother worrying about that crap. Just play what you'd like to hear. And the other advice about composing when you play, that wasn't my original thought. That's what Joe Zawinul said to me.
Mm-hmm.
He said, always compose when you play, which means, it's not licks. Respond to the moment, just like if we're talking. I mean, it's the old cliche of people in a conversation. Are they really listening, or are they just waiting for the other person to stop talking so they can say what they want to say?
Exactly.
And I feel bad because here we are, we're on FaceTime, but I haven't really been engaging you and eye to eye. I'm kind of looking around the room, getting my thoughts. But I'll tell you another amazing person that threw out a different kind of kung fu. And I got to speak with him on 2 occasions, but it was the first time I met him. James Taylor.
No kidding.
James Taylor.
Wow.
My buddy Don Grolnick was producing, and Don invited me to a mix session. And this was before Pro Tools. They were using tape, and they were comping a vocal track. So picking the word or a couple words or phrase from one take and combining it with another. So I'm just sitting and watching and listening, and it's interesting, and I had to go because I was on tour in New York. And we chatted a little bit, Don and I, and James overheard some. But as I said goodbye, the tape had stopped, and I'm at the far end of behind the VU meters of the console, and he's seated with the engineer. And I got to tell you, Terry, that minute that James Taylor and I spoke, I never felt more. How do I put it? This is a cliche too, but he made me feel like I was the only other person in the universe for that 1 minute.
I get that. I experienced that with President Barack Obama.
I've heard that. Wow. You got to speak with him?
I did. I was asked to put a trio together for an event that he appeared at here in Los Angeles, and it was a jazz trio. And so we played, but we had the opportunity to meet him. And first of all, he started and finished the conversation by using my name and saying, Terry, I so appreciate that you all played here. It was with Billy Childs on piano and Tom Evans on sax and myself on guitar, which was an odd request of a jazz trio. They didn't want a bass player. And, so we played the cocktail party. But we had a little private hello. The band got to meet him. And I didn't realize it until I saw the pictures. Yeah, because there's a photographer there. I actually had my hand on his shoulder as I was talking to him because he was in so close to me, looking me in the eye, face to face.
Wow.
That I didn't even realize that I was touching his shoulder. I can't believe I did that without getting tackled by the the security people that were there. But we were all vetted, of course, and frisked and X-rayed and everything to go in. But I felt like we had known each other, and the only thing in the world that was of interest to him was me and the band. And he ended the conversation after a few minutes by saying, Terry, it was so nice to meet you. And I can barely remember people's names of all the people that we meet.
What a pro. You know, the
was
other
incredible. Yeah.
The other person I heard a similar story was Leonard Bernstein.
That doesn't surprise me.
My buddy Mark Anthony Turnage, he said, I think he might have been introduced several days earlier or something, but or in the course of a class at Tanglewood.
Mm-hmm.
And early one morning, Mark went down. He was sharing that it was the composer's cottage or house. It's where all the composers were put up to stay on the grounds of Tanglewood. And anyway, Mark had too much to drink, so he's going down to the kitchen in the morning to get something to drink, milk and as he's pouring himself a glass of relief, there's Bernstein. And there they both are in their bathrobes, whatever. And And Bernstein sees him and says, Mark Anthony Turnage. He remembered his name. And
Wow.
there was no reason for Bernstein to have known his name.
Right.
But that he just had that amazing enough of a brain that, because I'm like you. I'm just awful at remembering people's names.
Yeah.
But maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm pretty good at remembering music.
I think it's a different skill set, right?
Maybe.
I mean, it's certainly a gift, but there's also...
I can remember a couple drum beats. I think. Although,
let me ask you, I'm so curious because I'm in awe of this piece of music, one of many pieces of music that you played on, but Both Sides Now with Joni Mitchell, the orchestral version, because that seems to be the perfect example of everything that you're talking about right now, with just being present, because that it feels like there's no tempo and time stands still, but the piece just keeps moving and shifting, and it's exquisite. What was the direction that you were given, and how did you have a preconceived idea of how to approach it as a drummer with the orchestra?
Well, we were not using click,
right?
So we're all playing, to Vince's baton, or as we would say, we're just playing to the stick.
The stick.
So the drums and the bass were in their own room, and Joni was in her own room, and I think Herbie's piano, and Herbie was only there for one afternoon. But otherwise, the orchestra was in one large room. This was at Air Studios, which is an old church in the heart of London. And Larry Klein was producing, and Vince had done the arrangements. So my first instinct, because whenever you play with an orchestra, especially if you don't have a click track, is that the rhythm section will have one understanding of where the time or tempo or beat is, and the string players in particular have another understanding of that. So you're, it's not quite like herding a bunch of kittens, but you are sort of trying to, get things to be somewhat coordinated,
connected,
rhythmically tight,
right?
And so I'm instinctively playing in such a way that I think will help make that happen. We do one take. This was not Both Sides Now. This was one of the other tunes. But when I went in and listened, to me the drum sounded like a bull in a china shop, and I was like, okay, that's not the way to do this. So I sort of did a little deep breathing, relaxed, and just tried to figure out where could I put a rhythmic reminder that, number one, wouldn't stand a chance of presenting any kind of conflict to Joni's lyrics, or anything written in the arrangement. It's kind of finding the open spots just to kind of just give a little nudge here and there that people wouldn't even be aware of yet would function to kind of keep all the kittens in place, as it were. So we kind of were able to figure that out. And Vince has a very good stick, so the orchestra follows him, and we all got used to playing with each other. Both Sides Now, it has this almost medieval kind of thing. The strings are all playing without vibrato, and it requires a really good string section to do that because you don't have the vibrato
to help with the tuning, the intonation.
Yeah, the intonation has to be like really good, and the touch and everything. So they're playing now. It's easy to either sound good or to claim rhythmic victory when you have Chuck Berghofer playing the bass. Because Chuck's really the guy holding it together. So he's anchoring the whole thing, and I'm just kind of providing a bit of a propulsive wash, if you will. When we recorded that, the take that you hear on the album is the first take. And Joni's vocal is at least 80 to 85% of that original first take. They patched very little in post. When we were listening to the playback in the control room, the bulk of the musicians, that is the orchestra, they were out in the main room, but
Right.
they were playing it back for them.
Right. Over the speakers. Right.
And somebody went, he said, "Oh my gosh, look." And we looked out and they were all crying.
Oh.
It was
Wow.
it was heavy.
Yeah.
It was really, it was interesting. I was speaking to a security guard, guy that just works at the studio. And he said, man, I don't know what you're all doing in there. He said, but I've never seen the local musicians behave like this. He said, this must be something really special. Because everyone was being so reverential and just like really trying to be, in the moment for every possible second. Now, all of a sudden, on a break, I get a chance. I'm having tea with Joni.
Are you kidding me?
No, I'd worked with Joni on the Mingus album and this, and then we toured. But here we are doing this record, and Joni and I are the only two in the canteen. And, maybe, I don't think I had shepherd's pie. I think we each had tea, and I don't know if she had a salad or I had some kind of pastry or something. Mm-hmm. And we're talking, and she's telling me about the house on Laurel Canyon, and I'm like, whoa. And she's describing the windows and something about the spider's webs and the way the sun. It's just this I'm like, wow, And she brought up something about psychiatry, without any context. I mean, just sort of psychiatry came up, or a psychiatrist, a doctor. Not realizing it would be a big deal one way or the other, I said, my father's a psychiatrist. And she just walled off from me.
Wow.
And so a few years later, I get an email from some drummer. He goes, "Hey man, big fan. I was in Brentwood, and I drive by this coffee shop, and there's Joni Mitchell outside with the coffee, and she's having a cigarette. And so I pulled over, and I got my copy of Both Sides Now out of the car. I was listening to it, and asked her if she'd signed it, and told her I was a drummer, and your name came up. And he said, it's really interesting. Joni said, "Oh, Peter," he said, "he's a nice man, that despite the fact his father's a psychiatrist."
Just to cap that story, one of the other tips in your book speaks to exactly this story. Learn the lyrics. It will enable you to play with clarity, intention, and specificity. Right there. I mean,
did I say that?
I believe those are your words.
That's me.
Yeah, that's
me.
Yeah.
Wow.
In a moment of clarity, apparently.
Well,
yeah.
It was a bass player who told me that, John Worcester, who used to play with the Kenton band, and he worked with a lot of singers. And yeah, he said, "Do you know the lyrics to this song?" I said, "No." He said, "You should learn." You said, "You should learn the lyrics to every tune." And it's great advice.
I agree.
It's not something I always do, but it sure helps to understand how to helps you understand how to play something when you know what the song's talking about.
I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know that we've been going, but so before I get to my closing questions, I just wanted to ask you, what lessons about art and about life have you learned along your journey, and how's your perspective changed as you've gotten older?
Wait, is this the big Actors Studio final question?
Or that's coming up.
Oh, that's coming up.
This is the warm up.
What have I learned about art?
Yeah, and also about life, because this show is not just about music and art.
Okay. This has been the interview of the long answers. Here's a short answer. Do no harm. That's what I've learned.
Okay. I like that answer. Since this show is called Making It, what does making it mean to you, both personally and professionally? And can you share 3 tips for success that have driven your career?
Well, making it, to me, I think it's always meant playing the drums in such a way that when I leave the studio or walk off the stage, that the artist is smiling, the conductor is smiling. In the case of a recording project, the producer or the engineer are smiling. So if there's a formula for success in drumming, it was said so many years ago by Papa Joe Jones. It was paraphrased by Buddy Rich, and it's, the job of the drummer is to play in such a way so as to make the other musicians play and sound better. So, if a musician comes up to me and says, "Wow, you made that really easy," that for me is success.
So that's not even being generous. That's just obvious.
Yeah. So, if someone came up and, "Wow, you got the fastest, right foot on the bass drum I've ever heard," that would probably put me in a tailspin of depression. I was
understandably.
That's horrible. Wow. That's too bad.
That wasn't the goal.
No. So, so what was the question again?
So the second part of the question is, can you share 3 tips for success that have driven your career?
Play what you'd like to hear. Remember that the music business, or I think anything worth doing, is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And be good to other people.
Those are great tips.
I guess.
No, they are. And for music and for life.
One of my favorite tips in the book was, better to be an hour early than a minute late.
It's a great one.
But now we're all locked up in our houses. So.
Well, it's funny because when we spoke the other day about scheduling, we both opened up our calendars and said, "So are you free on Monday?" And it's like, and it seems so ridiculous because where else are we going to be?
Well, in fact, tomorrow, Tuesday and Wednesday, I'm going to be pretty busy teleconferencing, teaching classes and private lessons to my students at the Thornton School of Music at USC. And it's a bit of a brave new world, but again, thanks to the president, provost, and our dean, we started doing this before the spring break and before most other schools were thinking along these lines. USC was one of the first schools to begin announcing the closure of the campus. It was in weekly increments, and then they just said that's it for the end of the year. So none of us know when things will get back to some sense of normalcy, and I don't know when I'll play live again, or when I'll be able to play in the same room with another musician. I have a couple recording projects, but basically, I've shut everything down. So I'm exercising every morning. I'm starting to lose a little bit of weight, and trying to get back into a habit of reading. I'm definitely catching up on some TV shows. I've been binge watching Better Call Saul.
Oh, I haven't started that one yet. That's a good. I'll put it on the list.
It's a lot of fun. My daughter Maya Erskine.
She's an actress. Your daughter,
yes, and one of the co-creators of a show called Pen 15, and they were shooting their second and third seasons, and they were just about ready to wrap when Maya and her comedy partner Anna Konkle and the producers they decided to shut down kind of ahead of the curve in Hollywood. They were concerned about everyone's health and safety. And this was just, the weather was starting to get kind of bad again with all the rain. And so I was proud of them for doing that. And who knows when they'll be able to finish all the shooting, but the second season's in the can, and they are editing, as we speak.
What network can people watch that on?
That's on Hulu. And in fact, I get Google News alerts about my girl, and every day I'm just seeing another list of if you got to watch something, be sure you watch Pen 15. That's PEN 15. It's on Hulu, and it's really funny. And also, I'll plug her movie. It's called Plus One. You can see that in any number of places online. It's a very, very funny film. So if you want a movie recommendation, that would be one of them. Man, we're catching up on films. We're watching a lot of movies. What was hilarious, I decided for some reason, I said, let's watch Dr. Zhivago. That old David Lean film. And Maurice Jarre, the score is amazing. I always loved the score when I was a kid. I had the record. Mm-hmm. And hearing it again, I'm like, wow, in my media room, otherwise known as my man cave. These great speakers. Wow, this sounds incredible. And I used to think, Dr. Zhivago, this, really, I think somehow I thought it was a sophisticated movie. It's one of the corniest movies. Wow. I mean, it's not subtle. It's really long, but having seen it as a kid, and the bad guy I didn't like as a kid because he was preventing our heroes, being able to be together, and he was a malevolent force. But watching it now, Rod Steiger does a really great job in the film, and if for no other reason you would want to watch Dr. Zhivago, just to appreciate Rod Steiger's performance and the music. The score is pretty astonishing, and I'm going to guess that it was maybe one of the larger orchestras put together back in, this is in like the early mid-60s,
right,
on the MGM stage. It's it was I think a 110-piece orchestra, which became the standard operating procedure for blockbuster films as of late. But I think back then that was pretty unusual to have an orchestra that big.
This is great. I think this is the start of a new weekly series, Peter Erskine's Weekly Entertainment Tips. And you can continue to go to Peter's Facebook page for more reading and LP. That's long playing records.
Yes. So I just wanted to mention, because I said I got a new turntable. The table I got is an Ultra Deck turntable made by Mobile Fidelity. It's a MO-FI.
Was this an internet purchase, or did you actually check it out at a store?
It was recommended to me by a turntable designer and manufacturer named Alan Perkins. And Alan is a really smart individual and a very talented drummer. And he made these like unbelievable turntables. Like these are like turntables that cost as much as a car kind of turntable. And he came to me because when he would attend these like consumer electronic shows or audio conventions, a band was put together. He was the drummer and the guitarist or keyboard player, I forget, was some audiophile / critic. Anyway, I guess because the guy was a critic, he was somewhat critical of Alan's drumming, and he had intimidated Alan. So Alan didn't have his mojo. He had lost that sense of ownership. So he came to me for lessons. And a lot of times, Terry, my lessons, especially with musicians who have been playing their instrument for a while, they are kind of like psychotherapy sessions. So in addition to maybe inheriting my father's love of teaching, I may have also inherited his, if not his compassion, maybe at least his willingness to look at some dynamics of what a person is dealing with in this, somewhat potentially therapeutic terms or a dialogue. And so anyway, Alan and I have remained in touch over the years, and I sent him an email. I said, "Hey, I'm thinking of getting a turntable," and I was looking at this one on the internet, and he goes, "No, you don't want that one. This is what you want." And I basically told or advised these folks, this is what you want to make sure your turntable can do. And it's an unbelievably great turntable. I've never had such a great turntable, and I've never had so much fun listening to vinyl. And it's brought back the excitement I had when I used to listen. When I was a little kid, my dad had this Klipsch speaker.
I remember those.
Yeah. He had just one mono. It was in the corner of the living room. And I just thought that somehow when you put this black disc, whatever this black object was, and set this, turned on the switch and set the needle on it, it woke up the little people inside the speaker, and they all started playing. That's how young I was when I started listening to records, and that was the only way I could imagine it worked. Mm-hmm. Anyway, this ultra deck table.
Oh, that's great.
Is really like super cool. Okay, so what was the final thing?
So my final closing question, my Actors Studio question that I ask all of my guests. At this point of your life, Peter, with everything that you know to be true, what would you tell your younger self?
Well, it's funny because the first thing, if I could go back in time, I never would have dated old what's her name.
Yeah, I could have skipped that one too, right?
The joke is, I'll never forget old what's her name. Well, in the book, when it comes to the study of music, I would have studied counterpoint.
I remember reading that, you saying
the overriding regret, or here's the one thing I would have done differently from most musicians, was they would have taken their study of the piano much more seriously. And I thought, if for no other reason this book has a purpose on earth, if it reminds or convinces enough younger musicians, be serious about the piano. But I think that's what I would have told my younger self. Maybe take it easy on the cheeseburgers and French fries. I don't know.
And on that note,
it's time for lunch.
Right.
Terry, this has been a lot of fun.
It's been really wonderful to spend some time with you and to hear your point of view. Just on closing, is there anything that anything in your mind or your heart that you want to share with the listeners as your closing words?
No.
Okay.
No. I don't want to make this a sales pitch. Obviously.
Well, I will. Everybody go out and get Musician's Lifeline, because it's a great book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I am proud of the book, and if anyone is curious and not bored to death by now, if you went to petererskine.com, there are some very interesting digital-only music downloads available there that some people might find of particular interest. Otherwise, just many thanks to you for doing this, and thanks to everyone for listening. And let's all hope we get through this thing. The only way we can do it is by being apart and being together.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you everybody for sharing this time with Peter and I. We both appreciate you a lot. Take care.
Peace out. All right, thanks. Peace out.
Tune in again next week for another great episode of Making It with Terry Woolman.